Hello, I'm Professor Fred Long, and I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. We're looking at Chapter 11. This chapter will cover second aorist verbs, as well as look at principal parts for these verbs. We will also look at the future forms of the verb ini, and then some common uses of the genitive case. Before we get started, let's go to the vocabulary. This vocabulary contains second aorist verbs, as well as a special preposition that can also function as a conjunction. Anabeno, I go up or ascend. Katabeno, I go down. Apothenesko, I die. Yinome, I become or I am. Sometimes this verb also has a sense of to come or to happen. Yinosko, I know or understand. Epiyinosko, I know about or I understand. Estio, I eat or consume. Lamvano, I take, I receive. Paralamvano, I take along. Orao, I see or perceive or I understand. Pino, I drink. Pipto, I fall or collapse. Eos, with the genitive, means until or as far as, but as a conjunction, subordinating conjunction, it means while. Well, thus far, if you've learned all the vocabulary, not all the forms, but all the vocabulary, you will be able to recognize 62% of the New Testament. That is a great accomplishment. So keep working on the vocabulary. Daily work is best. Let's go then to second aorist verbs. We've been learning that verb tense may be indicated by adding something to the front, by a change in stem, by a coupling vowel and syllable, and then by tense endings. Second aorist verbs are a class of verbs that show stem changes as a main way of recognizing their tense. Now, sometimes these stem changes are great, sometimes they are very minor, but there will be changes in the stem. Sometimes these stem changes are great, and the reason that there is such a great stem change is because in the history of the language, the use of one verb in one tense is replaced in another tense by another word, and so the stem is actually from a different verb altogether. So that's why you have sometimes quite radical stem changes, but grammarians have placed these verb forms together in terms of tense across the principal parts that we've talked about in the last chapter. So that's just a little bit of an explanation why the stem changes are so great at times. Second aorist verbs are formed in the indicative mood by adding an augment onto the changed stem and then using the secondary active and middle passive endings, which are exactly like the imperfect endings. So you have augment, change stem, the coupling vowels with the secondary endings, the coupling vowels of omicron, epsilon. So for ago, it has a second aorist stem of agag. And so you have augment, the change stem, and then the second aorist endings. Here, the active. So you have egagon, egages, egagen, egagomen, egagete, egagon. This is the second aorist formation. You would parse these as second aorists. Now, the only difference in formation with ago in the imperfect is the different stem. So you're going to use the same endings, but with ag, that would then be augmented. So if you replaced this part of this verb, you would be looking at imperfect tense forms. So to recognize second aorist verbs, one must recognize the stem change. And this adds some complexity to parsing verbs and then properly translating sentences. So here's some other examples with a middle formed verb, yenome. You can see that there. And there's other forms that are given here. Anabeno and Ionosco are somewhat unique in that the end of their stem, when they form the second aorist, will eat up the coupling vowel. The epsilon or omicron coupling vowel will disappear. So you'll have the raw endings added on to that changed stem. And these verbs are fairly common, especially Ionosco. The translation significance of the second aorist verbs is that the same as the first aorist. In the indicative, it's translated as a simple past very often. So here is a listing of common second aorist stems. This reviews the formation of tenses, and then I have a chart here showing the lexical form, which is the first principal part stem, and then I list if there's any compounded verb forms with prepositional prefixes. And then I show the second aorist stem, which is used in the third principal part, that is the formation of the aorist, active, and middle. Now, I've put an asterisk on the most commonly occurring forms. So these are the ones that you should really try to memorize first because of their frequency. So for balo, yenome, Ionosco, ercome is very common. Lamvano, lego, which has a very common stem change as well. Orao, id, very common. So you can see the listing of those very common ones to start memorizing. Now, we used to call these the dirty dozen, but you can see that there are more than a dozen. So focus on the ones that have an asterisk first, and then you can move on to master the others. Here's a complete list of principal parts of the second aorist verbs that we've learned so far. You can see what their first principal part looks like, that is the lexical form. You can see the second, that is for the future active and middle formation. Some of these verbs will also have a slight stem change in the future second principal part, future active and middle formation. So you can just kind of study that. Some of these verbs show something rather interesting. The second principal part will actually go to a middle formation. They will start out as showing active endings, and then in the formation of the future tense, they will use middle forms, but still with an active translational sense. And then in the third principal part, they'll go back to being active or stay middle. So these are the verbs that have middle formations in the future tense. Some other notes here are included in these charts that are worth looking at and understanding. For example, evrisco is a second aorist verb that will sometimes show an ending in formation that is close to a first aorist. That is, it's going to use alpha endings at times. Now the sigma is dropped off because this is a row. So that's something that we'll talk about with liquid verbs in the second half of the textbook. Look at lego, which has in the second aorist formation, it's ipon, and sometimes though you'll see ipa. So you'll have ipas, ipen, ipamen, ipate, ipan. You'll have a different formation with alphas that'll be using the secondary tense endings. That may throw you off, it may not. You'll sometimes have imperfect looking endings with omicron, epsilon, coupling vowel, and sometimes you'll use alphas, like the first aorist. Okay, well, second aorist verbs are a bit of a challenge for students, but I know that you'll get the hang of it. Here are the future forms of imi, isome, ise, este, esometha, eseste, esonte. And this will be the last formation of imi in the indicative mood. So you've got the present of imi, you've got the imperfect of imi, and now you have the future. So with these endings, you will have learned all the indicative forms of the verb imi. Be sure to do the checkpoint which will help you practice parsing these verbs. The last thing to look at is 11.6, which is common uses of the genitive case. Now, the genitive case is among the most dynamic in the New Testament. I remember looking up at an English grammar of the different meanings of the word of in English, and that grammar indicated 27 different uses. The genitive case is very versatile as well. Well, let's look now at the common uses of the genitive case. These are listed here after providing a brief introduction into the genitive case and how grammarians have categorized the genitive. I'm basically going to provide just an overview of each of these, and you can study the examples. The possessive genitive is how you've been understanding the genitive so far. One easy way to translate that is with the word of, and you can see the examples there. The attributive genitive is when the genitive noun is ascribing an attribute to the head noun. So the head noun is the noun that the genitive noun is in relationship with. So in this example, the genitive noun is actually going to be translated like an adjective as a modifier of the head noun. Here are some of my favorite uses of the genitive: the subjective genitive and the objective genitive. The subjective genitive involves a use of the genitive where the genitive noun is actually acting like a subject over the head noun, which is more like a verbal idea. So in this example here, the love of Christ, well, the love is the head noun and of Christ is the genitive. Well, aren't we talking about Christ's loving of us? In this case, then, the genitive noun is the subject, is acting like the subject, really, of the idea of the head noun, which is more verbal. Now, sometimes this verbal head noun, this kind of verbal idea that's represented as a noun, sometimes this will take a genitive which functions a lot like an object or a direct object. That's called the objective genitive. So in this example here, you dishonor God through transgression of the law. One way to transform this to make it more obvious is that this idea of transgression, you could almost translate as transgressing the law. So you are transgressing the law. So in this case, the of the law, the genitive, is functioning like the object of the head noun, which is like a verbal idea. To differentiate between the subjective and the objective genitive, try taking them, the genitive noun, try taking it as the subject of the verbal idea, or try taking it as the object of the verbal idea to differentiate those two uses. Now, the attributed genitive is when the genitive noun is actually the main idea, and the head noun is translated like an adjective, and you can see the examples there. Now, some verbs will take the genitive case as the direct object, and so that use is simply called the genitive of direct object. Another use of the genitive is partitive. It's called partitive. And in this instance, the head noun is only one part, one member, of which the genitive represents the whole. So you'll have one of the teachers. That's called a partitive genitive. And you can see the other examples there. You do have a genitive used for comparisons. This will be discussed more in chapter 25. And then you have appositional genitives. That is, where the genitive noun is in some appositional relationship with its head noun. Now, the particular semantic constraint here is that the genitive that's used in apposition is typically giving a more specific example of what the head noun is, the larger category. This is to be distinguished from regular apposition, where the one noun is abutted to another noun, and basically is restating it or further explaining it in terms of something equivalent. The last genitive is fairly common with certain words, and that is what's called a genitive of content. Certain words, certain nouns will involve being filled with something. And so if you have a net of fish, the fish would be the content of what the net is. Well, be sure to read the case in point, which will look at genitive nouns as they occur in Colossians 2:16-23.